I'm an archaeologist, and I just thought I'd put in a little funny meme here. And no, I don't dig up dinosaur bones, and yes, I do think I'm a Jedi. But so yeah. So my investigation has been the archaeological evidence of cranial deformation in Europe and the Near East for as far back as 10,000 years. So this is the map that I've been creating so far, and mainly it only shows you half of it, but the majority, we've got a spread all the way up into Russia, into France, into the UK, a massive concentration within Hungary and the Middle East, lots and lots of skulls basically. So, but it's not just the Middle East and Europe. Cranial deformation has been found on every continent across Earth. So all the way down to Australia, Indonesia, Africa, South America, North America, Europe, Middle East. So the first written accounts that we've got are from Greek historians. So all the way from the 4th century BC up until about 30 AD. So we've got Herodotus, Hippocrates, and Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger is one of the first documented evidence we have for the eruption of Vesuvius and the covering of Pompeii. So, and I'm quite interested in that because every year I go to Pompeii and I've been helping dig for the last 2 years. So the Greeks, when they're talking about the Colchis Empire, and they talk about the macroons or the Macrocephali, and that's one of the first lines where we get the first skulls called the Macrocephali group of people. So the Colchis Empire was the home of Medea and the destination for Jason and the Argonauts in Greek mythology, where they go searching for the golden fleece to bring back to the King Aetes. Yes, and it was a fabulous area. It was known for its sorcery. It was on the edge of the heroic world to the Greeks, and it was also where Prometheus was chained for giving the secret of fire to man and having an eagle constantly eating his liver every day and being renewed. And Herodotus does mention that they're probably of Egyptian descent, but that's kind of unclear at the moment. So they were very, very sophisticated even before the Greeks. So they had smelting and metallurgy way before anywhere else in Europe. So their urbanization was far advanced before the Greeks. They were a very sophisticated culture. So, and Hippocrates writes, I begin with the long heads, for there is no race in heads like theirs. The lengths of heads was originally due to a local custom, but nowadays nature too contributes. The people believe that the long-headedness is a mark of distinction, and the local custom is in question. It's basically talking about how they fashion bandage and pressure, apply pressure to certain parts of the head to manipulate it from its original form to a more desired form. So next we know that there's an Italian what would you call it? Just a philosopher, a mathematician. He was a very sophisticated guy in Italy at the time, and he was one of the first people that actually started categorizing and trying to compare and understand artificially deformed skulls. So, and then it goes relatively quiet, even though we do have mentioned by Spanish chroniclers who go into South America and they talk about the Mayan cultures, the Aztecs, and basically describe the craniometrics of what's going on. So, but obviously the conscious act of deforming the skull is it predates modern history. It's the oldest cases from the pre-pottery Neolithic B in the Middle East. And it's only really very recently that within the field of archaeology that people have actually started to try to focus on it and actually figure out what's going on. So the oldest case that we've got comes from Iraq, the Shandadar cave, and it was excavated in the 50s and the 60s with over possibly 29 individuals. Even though that is debated, it goes up to as much as 35 and down to as many as 25. So it exists. I don't know if you can see this one. So we've got Shandar Cave is in the Zagros Mountains, and it's the oldest confirmed skull at 9,000 to 8,000 BC. So also in the literature, there is mention of the fact that Neanderthals, there's two skulls that have been found there, and they're not sure whether they were deformed or not, but for a while since the 80s, they were mentioned as being the oldest skulls at 45,000 years old. However, there was a study in 2007 which completely disagrees. So kind of says that there's not enough evidence to exhibit a significant amount of detail to show that it is cranial deformation, where they postulate that it's actually post-deposit damage. So it's basically squashing where the soil's been placed on top of it. So, and then we go to Iraq, the ancient city of Eridu, which was one of the first Sumerian cities and was the capital during the early dynastic period. It was occupied between the 5th and 2nd millennium BC and hit its peak about 4th millennium. So it was typically Ubaid culture. So if you know about your Middle East, it's a typical kind of spread of culture that goes all the way from Iran to Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, and some of the most sophisticated ziggurats, houses, a massive amount of cemeteries. We've got the first physical evidence for boats anywhere. So they were very sophisticated at the time. It was a massive, massive port. And obviously, in the Eridu Genesis myth, we find the earliest description of the Great Flood. So in Iraq as well, we've also got, I'm not going to try to pronounce a lot of these names because I'll probably just ruin them, but we've got other sites that date from the same date as Eridu. Cyprus is one of the next places, and it's all contemporary with the same period as Eridu in Iraq, and cranial deformation in Cyprus was extremely prolific, and it was, I think, in about the 8th century to 6th century BC, you find a massive amount of skulls. A lot of them have occipital flattening, which is just the back of the head. So and then you find, typically within the next 500 to 1,000 years, you start finding wrapping, bandaging. So there's plenty of other sites, but there's a mixture of deformed skulls of both sexes. Some places you only have females that have been found, some places have only got males, but in Cyprus we had a complete mixture of all of them, and the evidence has been discussed and noticed since the 1930s, and the different styles and techniques mark gender, ethnicity and social status within Cyprus, we believe. So we've also got depictions of cradle boarding, which is where we get the first signs of occipital flattening. So once a baby's laid on its back for too long, if anyone has had children, you have to be very, very careful of the child's skull, because if it's left for too long, it can create an occipital flattening, which is called brachycephaly, and once it's set, it's very hard to get rid of. So, especially with cradle boarding, we find that it's a lot of cultures used cradle boarding, but not necessarily known if it was for cranial deformation or not. So in Iran, we've got the Shandadar cave up here, and we've got Ganjar Dare Tepe, which is 14 skulls have been found there, dating from 7th millennium to the 6th millennium. Tepe Genhil, where we've got just a single individual. Ali Kosh, but then we've got Kogasefid, which is at least 6 skulls, possibly 8 skulls have been found. Iran, we've got, I love this because it's one of the only actual depictions that we find anywhere, especially with pottery. So on their pottery, they've got depictions of cranial deformation. They've got figurines, they've got examples of children with their head bound, and loads of different figurines have also been found at loads of other sites, but these are the best photos I could find to show you. We've got Lebanon, Babylon, 4th millennium BC. We've got 42 individuals were found in the initial excavation, and at least half of them displayed intentional deformation. And the studies showed that actually the high proportion were actually just female. So there is a possibility that it was used for differentiating the sexes, but it may be that only the female skulls have been found. So we've got Turkey. We've got quite a lot of evidence for Turkey, and it's also typical of Ubaid, late Ubaid culture. So Degaramenti, I'm not even going to try. Yeah, the hyphens and stuff like that, we just don't have that in English. Understanding cranial deformation, this is an incredibly important site because the vast majority of the evidence is all children, all under the age of about 13, 14 years old. So you can see the development and the severity as children get older. They get first, typically they have a single bandage, and then they have a second bandage, which increases the pressure. So go to the Jericho skull. So this site of Jericho, obviously, is a massive site. I've got a little depiction there, but it was continuously occupied for something like 6,000 to 8,000 years, all the way back into the Mesolithic. And it's only very recently that these skulls, they've noticed that they have got cranial deformation. And it's quite significant because they're not necessarily sure whether these skulls were picked out because they were deformed and of a certain shape. And then they found a lot of these were placed in certain places within houses and possibly worship, possibly just there as decoration, but they obviously carried a very significant for the people that were living there. And also, I haven't got a photo of it, but I wish I did. There was also a skull cache with skulls, plastered skulls, found in lines and in circles. So that was very interesting. And then I'm going to take you to, I don't know if you know where these are, but Akhenaten was one of the heretic pharaoh, and lived and died 1334 BC, and it's got, especially, Egypt is very strange because even though you've got this significant amount of depictions and artistic work, you don't find really any skulls in Egypt at all. There's one which comes from about the 14th, 15th century, but other than that, so Akhenaten, Nefertiti, their children, clearly had signs and were depicted as having deformed skulls. And I'll show you this, but I'm not 100% sure, but this is actually the skull of Akhenaten. So if you can see towards the back, we've got a clear sign of occipital flattening, but not as a clear defined, let me just go back, sign of Nefertiti or the children with the more protruding elongated skulls. So next one is Armenia, and Armenia sits in kind of an area that is kind of influenced a lot by Anatolia, the Middle East, the Iranian population, Sumeria, and in the top corner of the country we find at least 6 sites where cranial deformation has been found. And it's about the late antiquity period, and we believe that it was possibly beginning of, how would you say, like social complexity, where people start differentiating themselves between people. We believe that it was the Armenians were doing this, and obviously we believe that the influence and dissemination of cranial deformation comes from the Middle East and comes into Armenia, and possibly stays there for quite a while before spreading further out again. So we've got quite a few sites, and got some very nice burial pictures. So this guy here is this guy here. And the site's date around, so it's not as old as other places in the Middle East. It's more towards the Roman period, post-Roman / early migration period. So there was definitely a lot of skulls, and it was 2 males, a female, and 16 children were found at this one site. These other sites, we've got other skulls, burial pictures, and they all kind of date from about the same time, but it's hard sometimes understanding whether these were really significant people or not, but generally based on the material evidence that was found with the skeletons, we believe that these people were of a high status within their culture. So we've got other places in the Middle East, we've got Syria, Palestine, Georgia, Russia. I've kind of included Russia in the Middle East, but it's kind of here nor there between Europe and the Middle East. But I think this skull was found, this one in Russia was found very, very recently, about 2 or 3 years. So let's get into Europe, and what we find is a massive, massive migration, which is possibly, it's the Visigoths, the Alans, the Avars, all these different cultures that are kind of escaping from, I should have put, I've got another map, but I'll show you the general migration of what we believe that the people were doing from the Siberian steppes as they come down into Europe, and the different cultures settled in different places, and all of them seem to have brought cranial deformation with them. So it's post-Roman periods, so it's called the early migration period. But there's a lot of skulls, especially in Germany. So we've got these 2 skulls of 2 females. One's currently being housed in Germany's Gotha Museum, and the other one, so these artistic representations are by a guy called Mark Laploom, or I don't want to missay his name, but I've sent him quite a lot of pictures of skulls, and he's sent me quite a lot of facial reconstructions, which I absolutely love, because it just looks amazing. So this one's currently being displayed in the Turkersfeld, Germany Museum, and it's of and there's about 20 skulls that have been found in that one particular place. This one's a female, and we've got other sites, so Elongated, which is these 2 skulls, other skulls here, Ostia. So obviously maps and borders and that didn't exist that far back, so we're actually talking about the same group of people, even though I've put them into different areas and the places that they've been found as of yet. So we've got quite a lot. I think the highest was Steinbrunn with at least 6 female skulls. Greece. So the ancient city of Marina was founded in the 7th century BC and existed for many, many centuries up until it was abandoned in the 13th century. It came under attack by the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Huns, the Bulgarians, the Avars, the Antes, but despite all of that, the settlement stayed strong. And I'm just pointing to an area inside the amphitheatre where there was a skull found, which I'll just flick over to now. And it's incredibly important because the woman doesn't display any characteristics or even seems to be part of the culture that existed in that time. So she was possibly an important foreigner that came into the site. Don't know why or what her importance was, but she had followed very different traditions, and she lived a very different lifestyle to all of the other women that were found within the same cemetery. She had a broken ulna and radius. She showed a high, rich diet, very calcareous teeth. So she was obviously of a very affluent descent, but she was still buried in accordance with the rest of the cemetery. So she was given the same honours as the early Christian people that were living in that place. So France is, moving on to France, we've got a very, very important place, because in France there are skulls that have been mentioned of being in the Bronze Age, and this was mentioned in the 1930s, though no such evidence has been found as such to corroborate it. But especially in France, cranial deformation was so routine and so special that certain groups of people living in different areas had their own significant deformation. So they had their own styles. So a lot of people would be able to identify different groups of people just based on where the style that they used and where the skull had come from. So if you can see on this is a map from the map that I'm creating. So we've got all the way down south of France, west, just below the Swiss Alps, all the way up. So what is it? Guri and Vexin is one of the oldest Bronze Age places. And there's a possibility that there are the Beaker people. It's a new understanding now that's still kind of in the works, that possibly the Beaker people that come in the Bronze Age were actually deforming their skulls as well, but that's re-going over some of the looks. Yeah, so it was at such a high degree that 50 to 100% of the population had deformed skulls, and a French physician in the 1890s said he'd personally examined over 25,000 skulls showing clear signs of cranial deformation. This was published in I don't know if anyone saw this, 2013. It was the latest one that had been found in the Alsace, France, Aubenas, and very intact, very amazing burial. So we believe that there's possibly no evidence from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age around the 7th century BC, but there are two possible skulls that were found in a tumulus. But as far as cranial deformation in Europe, France has possibly the oldest examples. And we find quite a lot in depictions of artwork. There's another photo, but I couldn't get a good copy of it. So this is a lady in the 1450s with a clear sign of cranial deformation. Especially in France, we also see a lot of it. If I go back to this, Merovingian, we've got headdresses. There's very styled headdresses, very unique. So it's possibly the reason that a lot of it was female was because of the headdresses and stuff that they used. But the stuff that have been found within the 2nd and 5th century are basically attributed to the Visigoths, a group of people that came and moved all the way across of Europe and eventually settled within the region of France. And it's been very, very well documented, especially in the medieval period, the Merovingians. And there was an instance of a lady in France in the 21st century where her grandma she was this older Toulousian woman, and she had wrapped her grandchild's head. So it's possibly one of the most recent cases of intentional cranial deformation. So if we go into Bulgaria, which is also the same migration period, which is post-Roman, and the Proto-Bulgarians come along with this massive migration, and even though they settle in what is obviously now Bulgaria, their heritage and comes from a region, I don't know if that's technically Siberia as such now, but basically a lot of the cultures that come from that area all seem to be deforming their skulls, and they bring that tradition into Europe with them, and it exists for several hundred years. So we find there's about 6 or 7 sites where different skulls have been found. We've got an artistic depiction, a recreation of what the lady possibly looked like, and so far there's probably about over 100 skulls that have been found within just Bulgaria itself. So this map shows you most of what is believed to be the Bulgarian migration. So as they come down come down into Europe, come down into Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary. The Avars settle in what is now Hungary. They follow up the Danube and carry on into the Frankish Empire. Some of them go down all the way into the base of Italy, but it's a mass migration. It's very interesting how people suddenly, after the fall of the Roman Empire, move so much distance. This is my favourite place, and it's probably the best display anywhere in the world, and it's in Budapest, Hungary. So if anyone's ever going there, National Museum and the Buda Castle Museum, they've got amazing displays where you can see everything about the culture, everything materialist, everything that they were using, everything that they were buried with. It's just amazing displays, and we can see this little guy just ominously sitting there, surrounded by all of his material artifacts, and I just love it. So we know what housing they used to live in, what style and what jewellery they were wearing, and there's at least, I say 200 in this, but there's probably more close to about 500, 600 skulls that have been found. And there are about 46 to about 50 sites. And it's not just one skull. I don't want to say it's badly, but we've at least got 10 skulls from Geztheli, Kizombo. We've got at least 21 skulls. So we know typically what they were wearing. As we can see with the females, we've also got the headdress style. We know what the males were wearing, their styles, their spears. This is in the Buda Castle Museum, which is actually quite hard to find. You have to go all the way into the museum and go all the way to the top. And I couldn't find any mention of it. I just happened to be wandering up there and just found it and took hundreds of photos of it. So we've got amazing depictions of the burials, the skull that was found, all of the pottery, the glass, the jewellery, everything. It's amazing. One of the best displays and actual evidence for who the certain people, especially the Avars in Hungarian, they were deforming their skulls, and especially the material artifacts that they were doing. Especially you find this kind of style of a significance towards hair and hairstyle, which you've got a lot of jewellery. We've got their weaponry. We knew that they carried more Mongolian-styled archery bows. So this is basically a map of what we believe the Avar people did. So that little pyramid there is as far as Attila the Hun got. So we've got a massive migration all the way from beyond the Black Sea, all the way into Central Europe, but Bulgaria, Romania, so along with the Proto-Bulgarians, the Visigoths, all of this, and then they move all the way down into Spain, Portugal, all the way across the whole of the continent. So it's a massive migration of a lot of different cultures, but it's quite interesting that they all seem to bring cranial deformation with them as well. So I want to say mosque, but I'm sure I'm probably saying that wrong. This is a very interesting site because this is the highest concentration of deformed skulls in Hungary. And there's 100 to 150 skulls have been found so far. And we've got a lovely depiction of what this lady used to look like. And the cemetery is dated to about the 5th century AD. And blood work was done on the skulls, on the cemetery that they were found. And they noticed that there was at least three generations of 4 different families. So what you actually find is in the first generation, there was very, very limited cranial deformation. There is 1 or 2 more incidences in the second generation, and by the third generation, it's completely widespread. So it's a good site in understanding the dissemination of cranial deformation. So you understand that it wasn't necessarily brought in and used straight away by every culture. It took a bit of a while for people to understand and to probably to figure out that people weren't going to die because of this practice. And this is another kind of believed map of the migration. So the oldest we find this far in Central to West Asia, come along into the Black Sea. So we've got the Armenia, Georgia, the different groups here, and then as they start moving and away from the Mongol hordes, they go further and further into Europe, which is just amazing. But I've included some of these places which have kind of the best information, but skulls have been found Czech Republic, Romania, Sicily, Sweden, Switzerland, Ukraine, the UK. It's pretty widespread across the whole of Europe. The American continents, we find there were several, the Belacola, the Chinooks, the Hopi, the Pueblo Indians. We have the Olmecs, the Aztecs, the Mayans, and it was, especially in South America, it was distributed between Venezuela, Colombia, all the way down to Chile and Argentina. So it was very widespread, especially in America. Mayan people were very significant in their meaning for it. It wasn't just aesthetic, but it was also religious and social. We have different groups of people that are allowed in the culture to, so there's one type of circular binding, which is only allowed for the nobility, where their subjects and the people that are being governed are allowed a more fronto-occipital flattening. So it's distinction even within deformation of who can do a certain type of deformation. And when some of the Spanish chroniclers, we know that they were absolutely fascinated by it, and they asked them why they would do it, to appear more noble, more handsome, and to be able to better bear burdens. And they believed that they were told by their gods that this is something that they had to do. But also within the culture, we know that some of the Spanish mentioned that some of the children were so subjected to it so much that often they would die because of just the intensity and the pain, possibly the problems that it also brought along with it. So also in the Mayan culture, we have some very nice depictions. So we've got two priests, and they've got the circular kind of more pulled, elongated skulls where the people that are serving them have the fronto-occipital. So it's very nice because we've got a lot of depictions. We've even got depictions of how they did it with their boards and bandaging. We've got another skull that was found in Sonaro just recently, and it was absolutely all over the web. Alien skulls found and everything like that. So it's kind of sad because they completely ignore the actual archaeological significance, the actual material evidence, and anything. It's just a bit more. I guess archaeology doesn't sell as well as sensationalism, but there's also they postulate that they could have been doing it to represent certain types of their gods. So I don't know if any of you know this site, Teotihuacan, but it's an absolutely amazing site. And so we know that there are skulls on the plateau that were buried down by the Feathered Serpent Pyramid. So just on the south side, we had a massive burial of about 10 to 15 skeletons, and at least half of them displayed signs of cranial deformation. So they're not sure whether they were people that were sacrificed or whether they were people that were actually involved in the construction of the pyramid, may have died doing it. Who knows? Peru, obviously everyone always knows about the Paracas Peru skulls, but especially in the Andes, the oldest skull that we know of is 6,000 to 7,000 BC. So it's extremely old. We know that it existed in the Paracas, the Tiwanaku cultures, and the Nazca cultures. So this is especially an interesting site, which is Moquegua, and it's dated to about the 600, 700 AD, and we've got at least 2 different styles of deformation, and we have at least 30 to 40 skulls that have been found on the site. And it's the site, even though it is part of the Tiwanaku culture, it's about, so Tiwanaku's there on the right, it's about a couple of 100 miles away, but it was all part of the same Tiwanaku sphere. And there's other sites, particular for commerce, I'm not going to go into much more. But we also have a Paracas skull in England. If any of you ever been, I think it's Piccadilly Square, which is the Ripley's Believe It or Not. We have a display of a deformed skull. So anyone that's interested, you know that there's one in the British Museum, Ripley's Believe It or Not, or the Ashmolean. So if you're ever interested in wanting to go have a look, then go have a look. Africa. So the Mengbutu people, the Sudanese, the Akanti, all the way, there's several different cultures that were uniquely independent, as you can see, and it's really good because ethnographically we know a lot about these people. We know why they did it, what they were doing it for, and kind of the passing down of knowledge, and especially I love with it the hairstyles. The hairstyles are just amazing. They go all out and extravagant, and it's on the next page, but I'll show you that the hairstyle is by far my favourite. So the Mengbutu people, Central Congo, just roughly as the bend of Congo, mixed with loads of different other ethnic groups, but we find especially significant is the wrapping of the children's heads. The parents have obviously got deformed skulls as well, and this style of headdressing is definitely unique. And this guy with his aerodynamic hairstyle is just amazing. It's just amazing. And so typically we've got the older generation sorting out the headdresses. We find a lot within the art of the Mengbutu people. It was so significant to them, but it was all about aesthetically being more beautiful, being smarter, loads of different reasons. Pacific Ocean, so Indonesia through to Australia, we've got loads of other skulls. This little kid's from New Britain, Papua New Guinea. We've got a couple from Australia and more from Papua New Guinea. But why? Why would they deform? And the thing that's most interesting is that it's not something you can necessarily just develop. You have to have a strict, continuous set of actions to be able to create what is the desired shape, away from obviously the normal head shape, whether it was a dolichocephalic, more elongated, brachycephalic, more rounded type of head. So there was a desire to get away from the head shape, but there would obviously have to be a conscious understanding of how to achieve it. So what I'd like to, obviously, I'm glad I've got a bit of time to introduce you to how we understand what is cranial deformation. So we break it down into basically 2 categories, which is intentional and unintentional. So typically we find with the intentional, we've different styles of wrapping the head, different severities of finding it, different ways that they would wrap it from the top of the head to the back of the head. And we also find in certain cases that you get a smaller jaw, a smaller foramen magnum in the top of the head. It affects different abilities of the head to change and stuff. But then when we go to unintentional, we're talking about craniosynatosis, the premature fusion of cranial plates. We have in utero deformation, where a baby might have stayed in the womb for too long, and by the compaction of inside the womb, it starts to then mould the head. We also know that within giving birth, that there's also different that can also manipulate. Sometimes you can find little babies' heads have got little elongated heads, when they're first born, and after a while they slowly go back to normal. But obviously, if there was a desire to keep that shape, people would start to wrap it. We've got this little guy who's a newborn who's got displayed signs of occipital flattening. And we know that unintentional can be genetic abnormalities, sleeping posture, or nutritional factors. So, in the understanding of intentional cranial deformation, we have at least 14 unique shapes. So there's a lot of kind of debating of whether there's more, whether there's less, depending on the age of somebody, depends on the severity of it. It also shows, so we've got frontal occipital, lumboid, occipital, annular, and parallel occipital, which is a very more elongated, but also collecting the back of the head. So cranial deformation is dependent on several factors. The restrictiveness of the constraint. How tight is it being bound? Is it loose? So if it's loose, it may not actually show much depressions, and it may not show particularly anything. So it's kind of an understanding, trying to figure out the severity of it and trying to understand, because a lot of skulls that have been found, they don't necessarily identify it straight away. So depending on whether the plane of the application, the length of the procedure, it depends on if it was done for 6 months, 6 years, 3 years, it's completely changeable. And obviously the age of a child. So if it's done from a newborn, like you saw in the main booted people, you've got a severe elongation of the skull. But if it's done with a child 3 to 6 years old, it doesn't become as severe. So frontal occipital, which is, so we've got two main styles that I want to talk to you because they're more represented within the archaeological record. So frontal occipital is the flattening and the squashing of the front and the back of the head, and it was used stones, pads, woods, cradle boards, and the actual effect on the skull, it created a wider cranial base, a decreased cranial length, increased cranial breadth, larger facial height, and compensatory growth in the parietal plates, which is here, which means it squashes out more that way. Or circular or circumferential, which is the wrapping. So you've typically got single wrapped, double wrapped, and it's more characterising a more elongated skull that we find is quite interesting. So why? Just why? Why even bother? Well, we believe, or several people have theorised, that they may have been trying to create similarities between individuals within a society where physical and biological differences existed, that it was a cultural marker to define social status, or an ascribed elite-like status. We especially know that within the Mayan population, that they had a distinction between certain styles of deformation and who was allowed to do it. Performed at the desire of their gods. The Mayans talk about they were doing it for their gods. Some of the early Mesopotamian stuff, possibly, but who were their gods, we just never know. Inadvertent consequence of routine clothing. So we know that some of the cases in France might not have actually been the intention to deform the skull, but it was more about the headdress and the headdress style. So it was actually a secondary byproduct of clothing, and used to demonstrate group affiliation. So if you had moved to a separate area, you may have wanted to keep your culture. People brought together by invasion. This is especially important in the migration period, where you see this mass migration as people just don't want to mess with the Huns. And obviously maintaining and strengthening those long-distance relationships and exchange networks. Possibly gender differential, males versus females. There was only males allowed, there was only females allowed, or there was a mixture of the both. And it is a very interesting thing, because cranial deformation as it's such was a very risky procedure to do, if we're talking about intentional deformation, because especially before the advent of modern medicine, we had a very, very high infant mortality rate. And the site that I've just come from this week, we found 3 baby burials. It's part of the job, but it's incredibly sad. So it was obviously very important. So despite these risks, these children dying, possibly due to the procedure or other things, they still continued to do it. And it was possibly linked to the emerging social structuring that we find out of the Neolithic period, where people start organising themselves better and understanding their different natures. So, but what more can cranial deformation tell us? We know that it was transferable between groups, and it sometimes faded out of fashion. Lorenz, 2009, knew that it had a heightened potential in serving as a basic cultural marker when investigating connections between regions. So if you think about the mass migration of the people that come in, where they came from, the Georgia, Armenia, up into Siberia, that it was definitely important for interpopulation relations as well as assessing ancient migrations, that it was the political elite shaped their heads of their offspring, purposely differentiating themselves from the rest of the people. So we know that, and it also, Ghazali was, I haven't got the paper, but there's only 2 actual really good papers that have ever been written in the last 200 years that actually accumulate all of the evidence into one. And it was in the 1930s, the 1970s, and a forthcoming book by myself. It's also very important because we know, and it can demonstrate how ancient populations were caring for their children. We can know that they were taking enough time to perform this, whether they were doing it for an ascribed kind of identity later on in life. And obviously cranial deformation is not something you can inflict on yourself, it's something that somebody has to subject you to. And they were consciously exploring the malleability and the plasticity of the head, which I find fascinating, going back 10,000 years in the Middle East, up until the 19th century. And it was definitely we're wondering if it was a transition of the Neolithic period from the hunter-gatherer lifestyle to a more prominent agriculture-based economy as a new social structure began emerging. So we've got the Olmec babies, as Hugh likes to call them, with their little helmets. And so modern day cranial deformation, we find it's actually quite prolific, and it's still something that we're having to deal with today. So as you can see with this little child, she is spending a lot of her time on the back of her head. Well, a normal skull, which is, you get a positional flattening. If a baby stays too long with a soft head, you start to get this change in the natural shape of the head, which possibly, through the earliest cases we know, are cradle boarding. There's no sign in the oldest evidence of any kind of possible intention towards it up until the 6th or 7th millennium BC. So, and this dynamic cranioplastic device is proven against correcting positional plagiocephaly. Plagiocephaly is, I'll get to that in a second, but it's premature fusion of the cranial plates. So we can find in today that we've even got instances of brachycephaly where children have been left too long in their cribs, laying down, and it's actually when you use this device, so you've got the shape on the left, the original shape, and then we've got the new shape that the device creates. And we also find that it's in Down syndrome children, it's used quite a lot. So I want to talk about craniosynostosis, the premature fusion of cranial plates. So this is a genetic abnormality, or it can be something that's affected by the culture, say cranial deformation. So what we've got is different types of, so we've got a loss of the sagittal synostosis, which is a complete loss of the sagittal suture, which is the line run along the top of the head. We've got meteoropic synostosis, bilateral coronal synostosis. There's, I think, I've got it on the next slide, but there's about 150 different variations of cranial synostosis. So, and And it comes from the Greek word plagios, meaning oblique, and kephali, meaning head. And modern physicians note that it's actually relatively common, and it's as high as 1 in 2,000 live births have some kind of craniosynostosis problem. And even in some cases of certain cultures, certain more isolated groups, it can be as high as 1 in 60. So it's still a problem that we have to deal with today. So yeah, 150 different unique genetic syndromes that involve craniosynostosis. So we've got sagittal synostosis, which is obviously the lack of a cranial suture. So once you've got a complete fusion, if you say that it happens quite early on in life, then that part of the skull will no longer grow any further. So that the rest of the skull has to accommodate that big brain that's going inside and has to figure out where it's all going. Otherwise, you just get a squash brain and you'll just die. So, but sagittal synostosis is the most prolific case that we find in the modern day. 60 to 70% of modern cases of craniosynostosis are sagittal synostosis. And there's a couple of papers that I wasn't sure whether to get in or not, but there's also an increased incidences of sagittal synostosis within deformed skulls. So it's incredibly important. And so, but there's also other issues that we know about cranial deformation that could be happened by utensils, forceps, the vacuum that is used if women are having problems during birth can cause a premature fusion of the cranial skulls, the sutures, and can then obviously affect the child for the rest of its life. Sleep preference, like I said, a more laying on the back of the head, a more inactivity can create cranial deformation. And we see a higher incidence of sagittal synostosis, especially in males rather than females, which is due to the more rapid growth than females of the skull. There are a belief that, was it Jose and Pap, 2012, they analyse old deformed skulls and modern deformed skulls, and then they try to look at whether and postulate whether these people were experiencing the same problem in prehistory as what we know today. So we know we had cranial deformation can affect the vision, can create deafness, an underactive thyroid, and underactive adrenal glands, diminish the functional ability, and it's very interesting because also the devices that are used also could create incidences of lice, hair loss, ringworm, impetigo, just cases of parasitical infections. So it's not always a good thing to do, and it's a very risky thing to do. So I want to try to get you to my map, but I'm just gonna leave this one with you. Sorry, I'm just interested in these funny ones. You never know, it might be on the exam. So yeah, this is just I'll go back to my map reference. Chronologically dated skulls, different areas, and each one of them is at least one identified and recorded place within the literature, but there's several different skulls. So as you can see, there's quite a list. So most of the skulls that have been found have all been dated in time. So the oldest incidents we know are in the Middle East. So it's from 10,000 to at least 4,000, 3,000 BC. We've got a massive concentration in Cyprus. We've got it spread across Italy, into Iran, into Syria, not necessarily Iraq, but then we've got it all the way up into Russia. A lot of these I've got confirmed identification that there are skulls, but the time periods are a bit more harder to confirm. So I have used them, but they're more of just one colour and one spread. So the greatest concentration within Europe is in Hungary, about 50 to 60 sites and hundreds of skulls found. And then we've got this general spread of this migration period. We've got these, I don't know if you can see the actual colour difference, but we've got this spread all the way into France, Hungary, and it's all part of that early migration period that I showed you with the Bulgarians, the Avars, the Visigoths as they come. So we believe that they come from this area of the Black Sea up into the steppe here. So we know that we've got confirmed skulls here, but as to the dates, no confirmed yet. But the main problem is that the connection. Is there any connection between the Middle East and Europe? Well, as far as we can tell archaeologically, no. But whether it moved from the Middle East, the practice, into this area, and then 2,000 years later comes with the groups of people as they move away from the Huns, as they come into Europe. And you can see this massive grouping of the period of the early migration period, which is about the third century AD to about the 9th century AD. They go as far as the Balearic Islands, down to Sicily, into Greece. And we've got one case in Egypt, and obviously we've got Akhenaten, but we've got eventually I want to create this into a worldwide map. That is my intention. So you could go, and I want to make this an active Google Earth map, so that all of these dots that you see have all of the information for them. So what was found, what was the date, and the archaeological reference, so you can go away and read more information by the people that have found the skulls. So eventually I want to make this a big worldwide map so that anyone and everyone can look at the research. And eventually, once I stop procrastinating, I will have a book out.